Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming to the spooky time, Cryptids and Creatures. It's spooky season, so I thought we would talk a little bit about creepy things. So are all of you creature people? Hell yeah, all right. Cool, all right. So my name's Brynn Metheney. This is me. And I am an illustrator and concept artist in film and publishing. I've been working in the industry for about 15 years, and my expertise lies in animal anatomy and creature design. And so a little bit about what I've done in the industry. I've worked for the likes of Warner Brothers, Sony, A24, HBO, Wizards of the Coast, and of course, Mr. Boots Riley, on working on a number of different films and properties. I most notably worked recently on Ghostbusters as their main ghost expert and wrangler. Creature designer, monster person. So that's a little bit about what I do. I've worked briefly in animation, which I'd really love to do more of. It's one of my favorite art forms ever. And I work also in Dungeons and Dragons, Magic, that kind of thing. The 5th edition was kind of my big job that got me kind of started. Not started, but it was like, oh my God, I did it. What the hell? I can't believe I did it. So yeah, I'm typically hired in pre-production where I figure out the nitty-gritty of creatures, animal characters, even just monstrous characters, that kind of thing. Like I said, I'm a expert in animal anatomy. I've taught animal anatomy for a number of years, so a lot of my preference lies in that. I do love drawing, I like painting, and I like just kind of messing with animals. I am also a goat farmer, so I have my own it's a homestead, it's not really like a farm, but we have goats, so they inspire a lot of things, goats, dogs, and all those kinds of stuff. So my background does lie in fantasy illustration and animal anatomy. I've always been fascinated with animals and creatures and how they're put together. Needless to say, I was definitely big into monsters and cryptids as a kid. I'm sure all of you can relate to that. We're all like monster kids. So today, I'm going to talk a little bit about cryptids. It's our guy right there. Oh, I love you. I feel like I'm home right now. Thank you, everybody. I'm going to talk a little bit about cryptids and creatures and how we as designers can approach them. What makes a good monster story? That's going to be our main, question this talk or this evening. And how can we as artists depict creatures and monsters that really tell that story, right? Just because you can design some kind of, big creature with spikes all over it and all this stuff, okay, yeah, but what's the meaning behind it? What's the story behind it? What's the history behind it? And a lot of things in cryptozoology, this sort of realm, come from, history and lived-in experience and all kinds of things that have to do with human evolution and time on this planet, right? Which is kind of what we're going to talk about. So for me, cryptids typically fall into 3 different categories, and this is just what I came up with for my little thesis here. 1, it's a case of mistaken identity, or maybe it's not, we don't know. The second is the interpretation or the depiction of an event or a happening that people cannot explain, right? And the third is a warning, okay? So these are kind of our categories that we're going to explore a little bit today. Over the past 3 years, I've been working on a body of work about the desert Southwest. I have been a desert rat my whole life. I was born in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and I grew up in Mojave Desert of California, and I live back in New Mexico. So I don't plan on leaving anytime soon. It's a very, very dear place to me. This body of work is a collection of not just stories that I've heard from locals and that I've experienced myself, but also family stories and just kind of neighborhood cryptids, that kind of thing, that I've come across in being in the desert as a person. It also explores a lot of real animals and that seem fantasy-like, right? One of the things I think that all of us as creature people can definitely appreciate is nature and how wonderful of a designer she is, and just how much nature is able to solve the problem of survival over and over and over in an endless array of creative possibilities. It's amazing. The desert often gets overlooked, and it's a place that I'm really interested in showcasing and highlighting, because I think that a lot of folks think it's a barren wasteland, and it's anything but. Like I said, there's a lot of family stories in the book. My grandmother was once visited by a light. She grew up in Roswell, New Mexico, very famous for a certain kind of visitor. But it also explores a little bit about how the desert is not prone or not immune to invaders or Western expansion or colonization, these kinds of things, and represented through certain kinds of animals that might come through. So it's a very dear project to me, and I've been working on it since 2019. I'm very excited to say that it's being published this year, and it's coming out through Flesk Publications. So if you're interested in that, you can check it out. Thank you. Thank you. Very excited, very nervous. It's terrifying. But yeah, it's really cool. So back to the desert. Like I said, I've grown up there my whole life. This is the Mojave Desert. If you ever get the chance, you are at the very edge of it right now. If you drive north on 14, you'll end up in Vasquez Rocks, and that is a beautiful hike. This is not Vasquez Rocks. This is the Mojave National Preserve. And if you ever find yourself driving east on I-40, stop there and check it out, because it is wild. Beautiful, vast, expanses of wild desert, all kinds of crazy animals. You'll see bighorn sheep, you'll see Joshua trees, you'll see rattlesnakes, you'll see everything. And it's all just right over there, which is bananas. But my childhood was full of thorns and lizards and weird objects found in storm drains. I did a lot of running around in holes I should not have been in because there's a lot of flash floods in the desert. I don't recommend it. But I grew up really taking the place for granted. And when I moved away, I realized I really missed it. So I definitely wanted to capture some of the local cryptids, regional ghosts, and odd occurrences that exist out there. So as I share some of this work, I'm going to explore some other types of well-known cryptids. We're going to talk a little bit about them and monsters, and explore how history and folklore all become one and the same. So let's start with our first category, a case of mistaken identity. When we think of cryptids, we think of a creature that lives on the periphery of human knowledge, something that slipped through the cracks of science, right? A lot of times it's like, oh, this prehistoric animal has remained unseen and touched for millennia, and now it's here. The Loch Ness Monster is a really great example of that. She's out there swimming around. Everybody knows she's out there. But we have yet to get a good photo of her. Right there. So we typically think of something that's kind of on the edge. And we have a thirst for knowledge as humans, right? We love a good creature. We love storytelling. I think that that's one thing that binds us all together as human beings, is that we love sitting around a campfire. We love telling each other spooky stories. And it's been not only a way to convey ideas about the world and interpreting events and weather or plague or whatever, but it's also a way for us to bond, right? And kind of understand the human earthling experience. And so seeing stuff out of the corner of our eye is a pretty popular thing. This is Mothman, in case anybody doesn't know. This is one of my favorite cryptids. So, of course, when we see these things, we like to tell each other, right? Oh my God, I just saw the craziest thing. I was walking, and I saw this guy in the woods, and he had horns and wings, I don't know, and then that gets passed down, and then that gets passed on, and then someone's uncle was like, yeah, and then I was there when it was born, and and now it's flying around Jersey, and now it's the Jersey Devil, and you're like, oh my God. So these perpetuative stories are is a beautiful art form, right? And I think that cryptids really capture people's imaginations, and it's a wonderful space for us as designers and storytellers to play and to have fun. So anyway, the discovery of a cryptid, it usually starts with someone's uncle seeing a creature on the lawn, and someone takes a blurry photo of it and calls the local police, and they do a story on it, or the local news, and they call a story on it, or they do a story on it, and it's a whole thing. And the chupacabra, I think, is a prime example of that. It is folklore that's like rekindled like every 6 months, or usually like every spring after like all the goats have babies and like, you know, someone like one of the baby goats dies. They're like, oh my God, it's a chupacabra. The chupacabra it comes from Puerto Rico. It started popping up in the 1980s. Farmers have always dealt with predators for like eons. This isn't a new thing. And there's probably been like versions of chupacabra before the 80s. It became popular in the 80s, right? Or it became like known to like the world at large, right? Farmers have always dealt with predators taking their livestock. It's something that I have to think about daily, owning goats. It's a very real, scary thing. And you know, when your livestock starts dying off one by one, and you start looking around, you're like, something's messing with us. Like, okay, I understood like maybe this goat dying because they were, you know, maybe on the edge, but then this goat died, and then that goat died. What's going on? And that's when it starts to get creepy. So what made it creepy for the victims of the chupacabra was that these goats were seemingly drained of all of their blood, right? So they became known as this goat sucker, which is what chupacabra means. Initially, the creature was designed as a like spiny, scaly little man, like a lizard man. But eventually, as it made its way up through Mexico and into the southwestern United States, it became more dog-like. It became more like this, right? So the simplest explanation, right, like according to science, is that this is probably a dog or a coyote with mange. Like it's that. That's what that is. That's a coyote with mange. But that's not as exciting. It's not as fun, right? Like come on, it's a chupacabra. It's totally a chupacabra. And besides, like what if it is though? Like it might be, you know, you never know. So, you know, maybe Uncle Joe isn't lying. I don't know. But as designers, I think it's like a really fun space for us to sort of skirt the line of believability. And, you know, what are the tools that we can use to kind of depict and sell their existence, right? This is an illustration by Matthew Diffie. And I think it's quite good at kind of capturing the like frightening look of a chupacabra while also having some like anatomical knowledge there, right? It keeps us sort of grounded. When you see this out on the parking lot, you would do a double take because you're like, wait, what the hell's wrong with that dog? And then you're like, wait, did I just, and then maybe it's gone and you're like, oh my God, I just saw a chupacabra, you know, and that's kind of freaky. But I have to tell you that as a goat farmer, you are always looking out of the corner of your eye because you don't know if there is a predator. And when there is a predator, it's suddenly very scary because you're suddenly responsible for all the lives of your little goats. And you have to make sure that they make it through okay. And so it's a very real, visceral reaction when a parent or a farmer or even just like a person who has like a cat or, and no, that's a parent, that's a cat parent. But like, you know, even just like by yourself, if you see a predator or think that there's something behind you, you're like, oh my God, you know, and that comes from like millions of years of lizard brain being like, is there something in the shadows? I don't know, maybe, we don't know. But the case of mistaken identity is a pretty popular thing, and it's led to a lot of interesting and crazy things in art and like folklore and legend, right? Imagine you're a sailor, like on the open seas, and you see this. What? Like, I don't know. And you've never been on the ocean before. You're like 16, you know, and you're like sailing and you're, I don't know, out there to catch something, and you see that floating by and you're like, what the hell did we just see? What was that? And you can't describe it, you can't figure it out. I mean, it's a bloated carcass of a whale, but it could be that. I don't know. Yeah, it's the same. But if it was like stormy outside and I don't know, the waves were going and you saw that thing and it came at the boat and maybe like went back under, like, I mean, there's a million different things that can happen, a scenario that can happen. And again, being an earthling is a tough gig. Like, it is not hard, it is not easy. And so, you know, as humans, we're just trying to figure out what the hell's going on all the time. And if you see that, you're like, it's gonna eat me, we need to get away from it. I don't know what it is, but I don't wanna find out, right? So there's a lot of, sorry, this keeps coming up. There's a lot of instances where, especially in the ocean, and I feel like as people around the world, all different cultures fared the seas, they saw things that they could never imagine. And we still don't know anything about the ocean. It's like we know more about outer space than we do the ocean. It's crazy. And so sometimes stuff comes out of it and we're like, what? What? This is here? And the creature's like, yeah, I've been here since the Permian, but whatever. But but what's kind of interesting is you see these these illustrations, and they're almost spot on. This person had never seen a narwhal before. Maybe they saw a carcass of it or they saw a glimpse of it out of the water, and then they told a guy about it, and then the guy commissioned an illustration of it. So this is kind of how that happened back then. You didn't have Google. You just had to hear from a guy who went out to the ocean if he survived. If he came back, it's okay, that's what that looks like. But what's interesting is that this feels really convincing, right? Everyone who saw this at that time period was like, that's real. And the reason why it's convincing is because there's a real care in the anatomy and placement of everything that's going on, right? As a creature designer, there's nostrils, there's teeth, there's eyes, all of this facial, structure. They even took the liberty of putting little gills on there, right? What if it breathes underwater? We don't know. They really thought about it. And I think that's why when you look at an illustration like this, you're like, oh, wait, is that a real thing? I mean, it is. They just kind of got it a little wrong here and there. It's not a fish. But for the most part, they got it right. But we were like, oh, it's a cryptid. It's this monster. It's a sea monster. It's not real. Is it? It's totally real. That's terrifying. These are sea monsters, really, in the sense of the word. So I really love this mistaken identity realm because I think it helps. It's where humans are trying to figure out nature and just what's going on because it's kind of terrifying all the time. So anatomy is our helper here. And I think that as creature designers, it's really important for you to really think about anatomy. Do a lot of studies of, if I'm just going to give creature design advice, because I assume that some of you are into creature design and are probably creature people. Yeah, creature people. Woo! Study animals relentlessly. Fall in love with them. They're easy to do. They're easy to fall in love with. Fall in love with anatomy. It's such a fascinating, crazy place. Especially vertebrate anatomy. It's all the same. We're all the same bones. We're just arranged in different ways, and that's what's so beautiful about it. Anyway, that was just a moment. But when I took on the task of illustrating a local cryptid from the Mojave Desert, I leaned heavily into scientific illustration for inspiration. So cactus head is a cryptid that's unknown to most, but to the locals of the Mojave and truckers that frequent the highways through there, the creature is described as a canid-like creature. So canid is a dog-like creature, similar to a chupacabra. It has a big, bushy cactus for a head, and it trots around, being creepy. So a lot of people have come across this thing. A man by the name of Earl Raymond retold his story of the encounter. He said, I was walking back to my truck, and the thing came out of nowhere, stood right there in front of me. I didn't think about it too long. I just yelled at it. Hey, bear. It was all I could think of at the time. Anyway, I think that spooked it. Good job, Earl. So Earl conquered cactus head. It was great. But following his description and sort of the other descriptions I've gathered on this weird little critter, it's about the size of a coyote. It has this bushy cactus for a head, and so and it has a long tail. That was one thing I kept hearing was that it's got a long tail that sort of can drag into the sand. And I took a pretty classic approach when I designed this piece, right? So as an artist now, I'm kind of thinking about it. Okay, how do I want to depict this thing? I want it to feel sort of like a scientific illustration of this cryptid. I want people to believe this is real, even though it's it is literally an animal with a plant for a head. But we got to make it feel real. So, of course, looking at reference, we got to look at coyotes, we got to look at dogs, we got to look at even things like raccoons and whatnot with this sort of arched back, right? I wanted it to feel a little hunched over, like maybe it's kind of freaked out, right? And I also wanted to pay homage to a favorite painting. I really like this Moonlight Wolf by Frederick Remington, and I thought that the greens and the way that the wolf is kind of standing there and the sort of diagonal composition, I really wanted to try to capture that in my own piece too. So something as, when you're dealing with illustration or design for these sorts of things, looking back to old masters is always really important too. It can be a great source of inspiration. I like this cryptid a lot. He's one of my favorites. I like him because like the chupacabra, it literally feels like something you would see out there in the desert at night while you're driving. It is not uncommon for animals to have terrible run-ins with cactus, right? I'm not going to show you any photos. But the cholla cactus, in particular, is a very mean cactus. I don't know if any of you have ever come in contact with one. I hope you don't. It is very extra prickly. Its spines are like little barbs that just kind of burrow into your skin immediately, and all of the segments on it are really loose. So if you bump into one, it just falls apart and like flies at you. It's the worst. But it's also really badass. It's like kind of cool. So it wouldn't be a stretch to say that maybe a coyote was chasing a cottontail and got its head stuck in a cactus and is running around with cactus on its head. Or it could be cactus head, right? We don't know. So it's one of those like wonderful, silly cryptids where you're like, and I've shown this to a few people, and there's like two camps. People are like, yep, that there's a cryptid. Seen it. That's scary. Like, I don't know, I wouldn't go near that thing. And other people are like, oh man, that's too bad for that coyote. That's a real bummer. So it's this like really fun way of like skirting reality, right? As storytellers, you want that kernel of truth. What makes Cactus Head work as a cryptid is that you would see that. Like, chances are one of us in this room is going to be driving on 40 at some point through the Mojave or going to Joshua Tree or whatever, and you're going to see this guy. And you're going to be like, whoa, did I just see Cactus Head, or was it just a coyote that had a bad day? We don't know. And, oh gosh, that's so sorry. I meant to change the background on that slide. But it kind of jumps into, like, as designers thinking about Cactus Head and these sorts of cryptids, we want to keep things iconic, right? As creature designers, as character designers, as storytellers, we want people to remember what we make. And that's difficult these days because there's so much being made and there's so much of it that's kind of like following a formula. We really want things to feel unique. And how do you make things feel unique, right, is iconic. This slide, unfortunately, you can't read it. It's, maybe you can. It says, what does it say? What does a lion look like? What is the first thing you think of when you think of a lion? The mane. Anything else? The roar. What else? Big cat. Teeth, talons, claws. Golden. Yeah. The little ears, a little poof at the end of the tail. I mean, it's a great design choice. All right, this is our boy. I don't know, I loved this photo. He's like, what did I do? I don't. He's like, ma'am, excuse me, you can't just take a photo of a lion. But yeah, so like you think of like a big golden cat with a mane and a little poof at the end of the tail, maybe some claws and teeth, right? So much so that like if you were to ask a child to draw a lion, they could do it, right? He nailed it, or they nailed it. Like, exactly. And so it is like, these sorts of little iconic moments, think about that as you're designing, right? What are the three things you could distill your character into? Spider-Man, he's red, he's got white eyes, and there's webs all over him. Any kid can draw that, right? You try to draw some of the like costumes that are happening, it can get a little crazy. But like if you keep it down, and it doesn't mean that you have to make everything like simple, right? But just make sure that there's like a couple things that people can latch onto. And that's what really attracted me to a cryptid like Cactus Head, was it was like, it's a coyote with a cactus for a head. That's wild. Like, okay. But you remember it, right? And kids will remember it. And it's all about kids, but like when I say kids, it's like, they can just recall it really easily. It's easy for them to understand. It's a simplified visual language. And I think that's why cryptids like Mothman are great. If you Google search Mothman, you get the same like owl-like figure with bright red shining eyes. Sometimes there's abs involved, which is pretty cool. Like that statue is really good. But go look up the Mothman statue. If you haven't seen it, you're missing out. It's bomb. Yeah, yes. Yeah, like the little Mothman baby and Dear Mothman. But it's the same thing, right? There is a visual language that's happening with Mothman and other cryptids. Chupacabra is a naked coyote, and Bigfoot is like a big hairy man, right? We love them. And so, as designers, we can kind of build on this, right? And you can make the designs more complicated as you go forward. Like if you think of, even like Final Fantasy VII, like Sephiroth was very iconic because he's got the two big bangs. Like everybody loves that. And the shoulder pad and stuff. But his design is complex. There's a lot of stuff going on. But you remember because there's like a couple things you can latch onto. So think about that. Case of mistaken identity, super fun place for cryptids to live. But also, as you're depicting cryptids or even designing your own, if you decide to do that one day, because you never know, you might want to. Or if you see something and need to document it, because you might see cryptids out there, think about that. Okay, our second category is the interpretation of an occurrence that people cannot explain. This, I think, is really important. Like I said, living on Earth is hard. There's a lot of crazy weather, there's a lot of crazy people. A lot of things happen on this planet that sometimes you can't explain. And sometimes the only way to explain it is through the interpretation of it, right? Especially if your understanding of something is limited. If you see a volcano erupt and you don't know what that is, what the hell just happened, right? You might talk about how there's a monster in the earth or something, I don't know. So some interesting stuff. So one of the very first ghosts that I visited for this particular body of work was a ghost that was documented on a trip through Arizona. And if you've done any driving in the Southwest, you know that it's a really, it can be quiet out there. If you've ever been out there, it's just all you can really hear is like the crunching of your feet on the rocks and the sand and the wind in your ear, maybe if there's wind. If not, all you just hear is like the blood in your ears. It's kind of scary sometimes how silent it can be out in the desert. And you can sometimes be the only human for miles around, right? You stop, take a little hike on the side of the road. There's nobody out there. It's like, damn, this is pretty scary. And so imagine being out there. It's quiet, it's sunny, it's like kind of bright, you're crunching through the trail, and all you can hear is your breathing. And then suddenly, from behind you, there's a loud and thunderous roar. And it sounds like clashing metal and steam, and it takes over everything. It's a locomotive. Okay? I know, terrifying. Railroads outline the Southwest. Large freight trains, you've seen them. They're carrying thousands of pounds of grain, petroleum, raw material, Amazon orders. They're rumbling through their landscape at like high speed, and it's loud. I don't know if you've ever been next to a train. You feel it like in your body, and you're like, good God, what the hell? Jesus. They're commonplace to us now. Like we see trains, we ride on them. We like get on them and stand in them. It's bananas. Like I lived in the Bay Area for a while, and there's the BART system that goes, and you're standing on it. It's fine. I've been to New York. I've been to Japan. Trains are crazy. But we're all like kind of over it. We're like, yeah, whatever. But they weren't always like that. The train was a marvel that had never been seen before, and it changed everything. And it was probably one of the scariest, most awe-inspiring things that happened to a lot of different people. In the mid to late 1800s, railroad networks began to expand west into the United States. And with these advancements came dreams, but also destructions, and it changed the landscape forever. This was the ghost that I really wanted to capture, right? I had set out into the desert to try to see what was out there, and when I got there, a train greeted me, and I was like, oh, damn, okay, you're here. This is cool. Let's work with this. So this was one of the first ghosts that I documented, and I wanted to explore a little bit of what it might feel like to really experience that roar of a locomotive for the first time. What was it like when people saw trains in the very beginning? It must have been wild. Like you'd never seen anything like that before, and suddenly it's tearing through the landscape, and you're like, what's going on? It was my ambition in this piece to really try to capture an all-consuming dark cloud that would represent some of the change that occurred. I wanted it to feel like a beast, Like I really wanted this to feel like it was like alive. And it was a challenge because I needed it to feel abstract, but also like it had some anatomy, right? I am like a big animal anatomy person. I don't like to paint clouds. So I was like, oh, I'll just paint a cloud with a bunch of legs in it. But it worked, and I really felt like it was capturing something that I was really trying to tell about this particular ghost. The railroads of the West are lonely, right? The train rips through them, and then suddenly it's quiet again. But like, what follows that train, right? There's a lot of like legacy in that, and I think it's a really interesting space. I also, the horse legs in this piece symbolize a lot. In the 18th century, Scottish engineer James Watt coined the term horsepower. Has anyone ever heard the word horsepower before? It's kind of thrown around a lot, and I don't know that like all of us really think about where it comes from. But it compared the power of a steam engine with that of a draft horse. And so however much power you had in a steam engine, they would measure it by how many horses were in the engine, or it could do the same amount of work, which is insane. Like if you think about like the only thing that was powerful enough to do anything at that time was a draft horse. And then suddenly they come out with this train that is like, 500 horses or 1,000 horses or however many it is. That's crazy. It's bananas. And so this piece was one of the very first ones that I documented, and it became kind of the symbol of this book, right? I wanted to capture these ghosts, these weird legends, these feelings in the West that I feel like aren't really explored a lot. The West is full of ghosts and like full of terror. And I think like New England gets a lot of credit. It's like, oh, it's because there's a lot of history in New England, obviously. But like, I live outside of Santa Fe, and Santa Fe's been around since the 1700s. It's a long time, and there's been people there before that, of course. And so there's a lot of stuff that's going on out there. So I really wanted this beast to feel like it was stumbling over itself, barreling relentlessly across the landscape. And I tried to capture that with all of these different horse legs, right? So sometimes creature design or cryptids aren't just about anatomy, but it's about a feeling. What's the feeling you want to capture, right? What's the like story or the intent behind that piece? Humans are always trying to explain the unexplainable, right? With artwork. Natural disasters happen all the time. It's a really turbulent planet to live on, and it kind of doesn't care about what we're doing. It's like, okay, well, guess what? This is going to happen now, and it's terrifying. Sometimes terrifying things happen because of us, right? And like, we do terrible things to each other. It's not a mistake that certain creatures come out of certain events that have happened, right? To try to explain the terror that took place. How do you cope with something so terrible, right? How do you make sense of something unexplainable like that? You tell stories about it. You make art about it. It's a really interesting place where I think a monster sort of sprang out of in New England. And disasters, invaders, war, all of these things that people try to cope with and make art about, they also make art about sickness. Right? So in the 19th century, tuberculosis took a hold of New England, and infectious disease caused just tons of people to kind of waste away and deteriorate and die. Sorry, this is going to be a really dark talk. And they called it consumption because it would just consume you, right? It was freaky, and nobody knew what was going on. Your sister would get it, and then your brother would get it, and then you would get it, and you had no idea why. And it would happen to like everybody. Didn't matter if they were healthy or not healthy or whatever. It was just happening to everyone. It felt targeted. It also kind of felt like something was after you. Like those little goats getting hunted by a chupacabra. It felt like something was literally coming to your house and sucking away your life. That's what tuberculosis felt like. So the people of the time, trying to explain what was going on, they thought maybe there's a creature that's visiting us. Maybe there's something that's coming here and taking away our life force. What could it be, right? Freaky stuff. It wasn't uncommon at the time to bury people alive. This was at a time when medical advancements and like telling if someone was dead was really difficult. Like somebody could go into a coma or go unconscious. They might be laying there for a month. You don't know if they're alive or not. Breathing's really shallow. They're dead, right? Put them in the ground. That's terrible. And then they wake up, right? There's been all kinds of accounts of this sort of thing. Spooky stuff. Family members of the dead would sometimes exhume the body to make sure that they were actually dead. And not returning to consume their family and neighbors. So while all this is happening, people are like, okay, this person died, we buried them, then we heard screaming, they're alive again, what's going on? That's scary, right? I told you this was gonna be spooky. Spooky season. And people around you are dying of some kind of disease where you are literally getting sucked alive. That's scary stuff, right? So a legend was born. Yes. People started thinking that there was a vampire running around, right? That maybe that your sister who died would come back from the dead as a vampire and start to eat you because she knew where you lived and she knew your routine and everything, right? And so she would sneak in and like take a little blood and then like leave and you're wasting away and you don't know why and you're coughing and you're like, what's going on? So people would literally go to their relatives' graves, dig them up, exhume the body, take out the heart, burn it, take the ash, mix it in a tonic, and drink it to protect themselves from the vampires. Yeah, it's hardcore. It's intense. And so, like newspapers at the time were like, believe in vampires, they're here. Instances told of where the living have been attacked and preyed upon by these representatives of an unseen world. This was seen as like, oh my God, the vampires have come to get us. Because it was real, it was happening. People were like dying, but they didn't know why. So yeah, a vampire, obviously. This is kind of what people thought was happening. Like your uncle would come back and be like, what? But of course, we learned later that it was tuberculosis, right? But how do you explain that? It's interesting and kind of scary, but it's something to think about as storytellers. If there's something that's like happening in your story that is unexplainable, sometimes an elegant way to explain it is through something like this, or to represent like a happening, right, of something you want to talk about that might be tragic, that is so big and so difficult to capture just with like, a couple words. You might need to like make some art about it. It's important. It's kind of interesting because the New England vampires, check it out. There's a whole, it's like, literally it's called New England Vampire Panic, like almost like Satanic Panic in the 80s, but it was vampires. It's always been vampires. And they went on to inspire Bram Stoker's vampire. There's like evidence that he had some of these newspaper clippings in his journal while he was writing that story of Dracula. So pretty interesting stuff. All right, our last category is a warning. This is one of my favorites because it's really just adults trying to get kids to behave. And I'm an aunt. Yeah. Yes, I'm an aunt. So I sometimes like, you're like, if you go in there, something's going to eat you. Just don't go in there. Don't go in the woods. But adults have been using monsters to warn children into good behavior since the beginning of time. Like, it's just something that we've all done. Like, oh, don't go into the woods. The witch will get you. The term boogeyman, some sort of thing out there, right? Don't walk alone. What's kind of terrible is it's totally based in reality, right? Like you don't know, there might be a crazy guy out there who's gonna take you. But mostly, the like theme in these stories, my favorite is the kid getting like tripped by his brother, and he's like, "Peace out, Nicholas. See you later." I know, it's so brutal. I'm like, damn. Okay. Yeah. Totally. But mostly the like theme around these creatures is that like they show up, they take your kids if they're misbehaved, or if they wander too far from home. So Eastern Alpine folklore tells a story about Krampus. I think a lot of folks here know who Krampus is. It's almost time for Krampus. The holidays are coming. In Spain, we've got El Hombre del... shit, I'm very sorry. El Hombre del Saco, which is the sack man. It's pretty cool. He is usually depicted as just... this is my favorite. A mean and impossibly ugly and skinny old man. Damn, okay. Jeez. Who eats the misbehaving children that he collects. So it's all around like, yeah, like kids need to just behave. But it's like this reoccurring thing, right? In Japan, the Namehage visits your house each New Year's Eve, and if any of your kids are misbehaving or lazy, he'll just take them. And in fact, it's a good thing if like he like doesn't come or like visits and it's like, oh no, you're all good here. You're all doing what you need to do. Like, I'll see you later. Yeah. So if every culture kind of has this version of like a boogeyman, like a warning, right? And I think it's kind of this interesting space where, you know, monsters and creatures and cryptids sort of like fall into this way to sort of like help the next generation. Like, don't do this because it's like you're gonna get killed, you know, that kind of thing. It's really interesting. So when talking about a warning, especially in the West, I, you know, approached it from a place that's really close to home, and that's in New Mexico. And if any of you know about the Trinity Project in New Mexico, you know that it was a pretty crazy thing that happened there. So the Manhattan Project, which is what it's also called, conducted its first nuclear test in New Mexico. This like happened like 200 miles south of Los Alamos, in the deserts of White Sands. There's an obelisk that stands there now as a reminder of the place and what happened there. Upon detonation, the plutonium implosion device, as they called it, released 18.6 kilotons of power, and it turned the entire surrounding sands in the area into green glass instantly. So this was a like wild event, right? And people like stood around and watched it. Like, just, it's fine. You're fine. The resulting glass that's found in the area, you can find these little rocks out there. They're called trinitite, and they're named after the Trinity Project. Don't pick them up. Your hand will rot off. But again, like, I just want to take a moment, like a sidebar. I'm talking about this, and it sounds like fantasy shit. Sorry. Fantasy stuff, and it's I get really passionate. It sounds like fantasy stuff, right? It's crazy. Like if you touch this rock, your hand's gonna fall off. What? Like bananas? I don't know. Ranchers in the area reported bleeding and burns on livestock from the fallout, and the local population suffered illness, cancer, and death months and years after the explosion that they were never warned about. So a lot of folks in the area were just deemed not important enough to know about it. Is what happened. And it's a pretty crazy bit of history from my home state. I wanted to try to capture a bit of a warning. And since then, old curses walk the land, bearing witness to the way things change. So this is my friend here. Horns shiny black and eyes blood red, the black steer cometh when we're all dead. This piece is kind of my answer to a little bit of that. It's sort of a warning, right? It's a really interesting point in history, and I think it's like kind of a crazy place to go visit. And if you're ever out there, you know, do it, but just don't pick up any rocks. You know, this black obelisk was a real big inspiration in the look of the steer. It's, you know, it's black. It looks like burned earth. His eyes are blood red. It's, you know, something I'm thinking about when I'm trying to like illustrate the gravity of this situation. And I don't even know if this really captures it, but I tried my hardest. I'm also really inspired by Johnny Cash's song "Ghost Riders in the Sky," which is kind of nerdy and probably weird to say, but I think that this song is like totally to the scientists of that time, right? Because at the end of the song, he says, like, you know, go back, don't continue on your ways, like, leave, and then you won't have to be trapped in the sky chasing these, like, deadly cattle through ragged, cloudy skies, right? It sounds like, you know, the lyrics to this song almost sound like a nuclear explosion when you really read it. And I just There was something about that. The song was written originally by Stan Jones, just FYI, and it was performed by Johnny Cash, just so we're credited the right people. But listen to it, it's haunting. And it hits different if you're driving through the desert. So next time you are driving on I-40, make sure you put on Johnny Cash. I explored a lot of bad omens and warnings in this book because I feel like cryptids as a whole are kind of a warning always, right? They're sort of this like thing out of this corner of your eye. The ghost that visits you in your hallway at night is somebody like trying to give you a warning. Or maybe there's someone watching over you, right? It's not always bad. It's not always like, hey, I'm gonna eat you. Sometimes it's like, hey, I'm looking out for you. It's fine. It's like ambivalent, or it's friendly, that kind of thing. So I really wanted to try to capture some of the omens that exist there. One that I was really interested in capturing was the Trona mule. Trona, I don't know if has anybody driven through Trona? All right, yeah. Nobody knows about Trona. And you should, though. They produce the most sodium bicarbonate in the United States. But they are like a dry lake bed north of here on the way to Vegas. You probably have driven through it, but didn't realize you did. And it is pretty much known for its mineral production. So this mule is a mineral-encrusted mule that shows up. It can be spotted at sunrise, and it is wandering the steam vents around the mineral plains out there in Trona. I wanted this mule to feel kind of ambivalent, spooky, haunting, that kind of thing, right? This particular cryptid was hard to find out about, but I did find out that it showed up when prospectors were surveying the area for its worth. So as they were out there kind of poking around and thinking about ripping up all those minerals out of the ground, this thing showed up. Interesting, creepy. It's thought to be a bad omen. Mineral mining is big in the desert Southwest. Death Valley was mined for borax, and 20 mule teams would pull that borax all the way from Death Valley to Mojave, where it was later transported to the railroad, and it would take it to San Francisco and Los Angeles. So California is like crazy. There's so much amazing history and like stuff out here that you can work with, and just all these amazing crazy bits that you can pull from as creature designers, right? So, bad omens of the West, spooky stuff. All right, so we're almost done, and I want to leave you with like a cryptid. Thank you. A bit of a story, and I think we'll have time in case anybody wants to share a spooky story, ghost encounters, cryptid encounters. But this is something that I encountered recently on a camping trip. It's called a fire spit. If you are sitting around your campfire, you want to be a little aware of it, right? Letting your guard down can invite one of these things in. It's a grotesque and invasive specter, and it takes on a horrifying and distorted form as it approaches your campfire. If you see one, look at the moon, and you'll cleanse your eyes. They typically, sit at just the edge of your vision, and they're already gone by the time you've been spooked. So watch out for those campfire spits. They're spooky. The rest of the sources. These are some of my sources. There's some other sources that are, oh, there they go. Okay, they're back. Wait, no. And so, that's a little bit about cryptids, creatures, and spooky things.